The white cotton fabric tore with a sound that would haunt Madison Carter's dreams for weeks to come. But in that moment, as Rebecca Sullivan's school blouse split apart in the crowded locker room, revealing something no 17-year-old should have hidden beneath their clothes, Madison realized she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. What looked like tactical gear gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Compression bandages wrapped around scars that told stories no teenager should know, and Rebecca's eyes held a coldness that made Madison's blood freeze in her veins. At Riverside High School, where secrets hide behind perfect smiles and honor roll certificates, 3 students were about to discover that some mysteries run deeper than homework assignments and weekend parties. If you've ever felt like your whole world was built on lies, comment below and share what happened when the truth finally came to light. Today's story shows how one moment of cruelty can unravel decades of carefully buried secrets. And honestly, your support helps us keep bringing these powerful stories to life. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in October, leaves dancing outside classroom windows while students shuffled through hallways that smelled of disinfectant and teenage anxiety. Rebecca Sullivan moved through Riverside High like a ghost, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her gray eyes constantly scanning the environment with a precision that would have impressed military instructors. She'd been at Riverside for exactly 47 days. Not that anyone was counting, though Rebecca kept track of everything these days. Madison Carter, on the other hand, commanded attention without trying, her blonde hair cascading in perfect waves, her designer clothes marking her as royalty in the high school hierarchy. As captain of the varsity cheerleading squad and daughter of the town's most influential city councilman, Madison wielded social power like a weapon. But lately, that weapon had been aimed exclusively at one target. Rebecca Sullivan represented everything Madison couldn't control, everything that threatened the carefully constructed world Madison's family had built on foundations of sand and silence. Charlie Rodriguez sat in the back corner of every classroom, fingers dancing across laptop keys with the kind of expertise that made teachers nervous and administrators suspicious, while other students worried about pop quizzes and dating drama. Charlie worried about digital footprints and encrypted communications, because in a town where information meant power, Charlie had learned to speak the language of secrets fluently. The first incident had been subtle. Rebecca's locker combination mysteriously changed, her homework assignments disappearing from her backpack, whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. Madison's campaign of harassment felt almost professional in its execution, systematic and calculated, like someone with experience in psychological warfare. But Rebecca had experience too, the kind that came from surviving situations most people only saw in nightmares. 3 weeks into the harassment campaign, Charlie noticed the pattern. Every incident coincided perfectly with milestones in a certain investigation being conducted by the Riverside Police Department. Detective Thomas Sullivan, Rebecca's adoptive father, had been building a case against corruption in the city government. And somehow, Madison Carter seemed to know exactly when pressure was mounting. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, too deliberate to be teenage drama. Rebecca had learned long ago not to trust coincidences. Growing up in foster care before Thomas adopted her had taught survival lessons most children never needed. But the skills she'd developed since the adoption ran deeper than street smarts. Every Tuesday and Thursday after school, Rebecca drove to the county training facility where she worked with the SWAT team's tactical instructors. Thomas told people it was therapy for trauma. What he didn't mention was that Rebecca had become one of their most promising trainees. The morning everything changed started with Madison's usual routine: gathering her crew in the parking lot before first period, planning the day's psychological warfare with military precision. Sarah Mitchell and Jessica Reynolds flanked Madison like loyal lieutenants, their expensive handbags hiding phones loaded with compromising photos and carefully edited screenshots designed to destroy reputations. For 6 weeks, they'd been systematically isolating Rebecca from any potential friendships, spreading rumors about her mysterious past and her adoptive father's obsessive work habits. But Madison's real motivation ran deeper than typical high school cruelty. 3 months earlier, she'd discovered files on her father's computer that made her stomach turn. Richard Carter's political career had been built on a foundation of bribes, cover-ups, and buried investigations, and Detective Sullivan's current case threatened to expose everything. Madison's attacks on Rebecca weren't random teenage bullying. They were desperate attempts to distract a detective by hurting the person he loved most. The locker room incident began as planned. Madison and her crew cornering Rebecca during the lunch period when most students were in the cafeteria. The plan was simple: humiliate Rebecca so thoroughly that she'd beg her father to transfer her to another school, removing Thomas Sullivan's emotional anchor in Riverside and hopefully derailing his investigation. Madison had orchestrated similar campaigns before, pushing students until they cracked, using social pressure like a scalpel to cut away threats to her family's power. But when Madison grabbed Rebecca's blouse and pulled, when the fabric gave way with that horrible tearing sound, when Rebecca's hidden tactical gear became visible to everyone in the locker room, Madison realized she wasn't dealing with a typical transfer student. The compression wrapping around Rebecca's torso wasn't fashion. It was functional. The small scars visible along her collarbone weren't accidental. They were evidence of violence that made high school drama look like children's games. Rebecca's response to the attack was swift and terrifying, not the tears or screaming Madison had expected, but the cold, calculated movement of someone trained to neutralize threats. In less than 3 seconds, Rebecca had assessed the situation, identified escape routes, and positioned herself defensively, her posture shifting from teenage victim to something that made Madison's trained cheerleaders step backward involuntarily. "Interesting choice," Rebecca said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded storms. Destroying someone's clothes in a room full of witnesses, recording everything on phones that can be subpoenaed, creating evidence of assault that will look great in court testimony. Her gray eyes swept the room, cataloging faces and positions with professional efficiency. "I'm curious to see how your father explains this strategy to his lawyers." The mention of Madison's father sent ice through the cheerleader's veins, because Rebecca Sullivan wasn't supposed to know about Richard Carter's legal troubles. The investigation was classified, the evidence sealed, the entire case built in secret to prevent exactly this kind of interference. But somehow, this quiet transfer student with tactical gear hidden under her school uniform knew details that could destroy Madison's family. Charlie Rodriguez had been monitoring the situation through carefully placed surveillance equipment, tiny cameras hidden in locker room vents, audio pickups disguised as maintenance equipment, digital breadcrumbs that painted a complete picture of Madison's harassment campaign. When Rebecca's tactical gear became visible, when the locker room erupted in shocked whispers, when Madison's face went pale with the realization that her victim knew far more than expected, Charlie began uploading files to secure servers with practiced efficiency. The evidence Charlie had collected over 6 weeks would have impressed professional investigators. Time-stamped photos of Madison planting evidence in Rebecca's locker, audio recordings of planning sessions that revealed the sophisticated nature of the harassment campaign, digital trails that connected Madison's attacks to specific developments in her father's legal troubles. But the most damning evidence was the pattern itself, how every escalation in the bullying campaign coincided perfectly with Detective Sullivan's investigative milestones. Thomas Sullivan arrived at Riverside High 23 minutes after receiving Charlie's encrypted message. His unmarked police car cutting through afternoon traffic with the urgency of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. As lead detective on the corruption case against Richard Carter, Thomas had been expecting retaliation. What he hadn't anticipated was that the attacks would target his daughter at school. The harassment campaign represented a new level of desperation, evidence that the corruption investigation was close to breaking open. Walking through Riverside High's hallways, past displays of academic achievement and college preparation brochures, Thomas felt the weight of every case he'd worked in 15 years of law enforcement. But this case was different. This case was personal, in ways that made his detective instincts war with his parental protective instincts. Rebecca had already survived trauma that would have broken most adults. She didn't deserve to become collateral damage in a war between justice and corruption. Rebecca sat in the principal's office, her torn blouse replaced with a spare shirt from the lost and found, her tactical gear hidden once again beneath normal teenage clothing. But Principal Williams kept glancing at her nervously, because word had already spread through the school's administrative network about what lay beneath that innocent exterior. The principal had worked in education for 22 years. He'd seen troubled students, traumatized students, students who'd survived unthinkable circumstances. But he'd never seen a teenager who radiated the kind of controlled danger that Rebecca Sullivan projected. Madison paced outside the principal's office, her cheerleading uniform pristine, except for the small tear where Rebecca had grabbed her wrist to prevent further attack. The physical contact had lasted less than 2 seconds, but Madison could still feel the precise pressure Rebecca had applied, exactly enough to stop the assault without causing injury, delivered with the kind of professional restraint that suggested extensive training. Madison's father had taught her to recognize power in all its forms, and Rebecca Sullivan wielded a type of power that made Madison's social influence look like children's games. The investigation files that Charlie had uncovered painted a picture that made Madison's stomach churn with guilt and terror. Her father's corruption went back decades, involving drug money, human trafficking, and the systematic elimination of witnesses who threatened the operation. Detective Sullivan's case had already connected Richard Carter to 7 unsolved disappearances, and the evidence suggested that Rebecca's birth parents had been among the victims. The harassment campaign hadn't just been cruel, it had been an attack on a girl whose family had already been destroyed by the same corruption network. When Thomas Sullivan entered the principal's office, when he saw his daughter sitting calmly, despite having her hidden trauma exposed to her classmates, when he read the initial incident report that described Madison's attack in clinical detail, something shifted in his investigative approach. The corruption case had been about justice. Now it became about protection. Rebecca had endured enough violence for one lifetime. It was time to ensure she never endured it again. The meeting that followed would change everything. Principal Williams struggling to maintain administrative neutrality while dealing with a situation that clearly extended beyond typical school discipline. Thomas Sullivan shifting between detective mode and protective father mode as he processed what his daughter had experienced. Rebecca herself displaying the kind of emotional control that impressed and worried the adults in equal measure. But the most significant moment came when Madison Carter was called into the office, when she faced the detective whose investigation threatened her father's freedom. Madison's confession came in fragments, admissions of guilt mixed with desperate justifications, explanations of family pressure and threatening phone calls that had driven her to increasingly desperate measures. She described finding the investigation files on her father's computer, learning about crimes that made her question everything she'd believed about her family, discovering that Detective Sullivan's case could send her father to prison for life. The harassment campaign had been her attempt to fight back, her effort to protect the only family she'd ever known, even if that family was built on a foundation of violence and corruption. But as Madison spoke, as her careful composure cracked under the weight of weeks of pressure and fear, as she revealed the true scope of her father's crimes and her own role in the cover-up attempt, Thomas Sullivan realized they were dealing with something much larger than school bullying. Madison Carter wasn't just a cruel teenager. She was a victim of the same corruption network that had destroyed Rebecca's birth family. Her father's crimes had poisoned every relationship in her life, turning her into a weapon against other victims in a war she barely understood. Rebecca listened to Madison's confession with the kind of professional attention that would have impressed courtroom stenographers, cataloging details, connecting dots, building a complete picture of how personal trauma and family corruption had created the perfect storm of violence that had exploded in the locker room. But beneath her analytical approach, Rebecca felt something unexpected, not the satisfaction of seeing her tormentor broken, but the recognition of shared victimhood. Madison Carter had been shaped by the same violent system that had orphaned Rebecca. They were both casualties of Richard Carter's criminal empire. The evidence Charlie had collected suddenly took on new significance. The surveillance footage that documented Madison's harassment campaign also revealed the sophisticated nature of the psychological pressure being applied to force her participation. Phone calls that triggered escalations in the bullying, meetings with unidentified adults who seemed to be coordinating Madison's actions, financial pressure applied to Madison's family that correlated perfectly with her increased desperation. Madison hadn't just been a bully. She'd been a tool used by her father's criminal network to interfere with a legitimate police investigation. As afternoon turned to evening, as the principal's office filled with evidence that extended far beyond school jurisdiction, as Thomas Sullivan called for backup investigators who specialized in organized crime and corruption cases, the true scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. Richard Carter's criminal network had infiltrated every level of Riverside's power structure, from city government to law enforcement to the school administration itself. The harassment campaign against Rebecca had been just one small part of a larger effort to derail the investigation that threatened to expose decades of crime. But Madison's confession had provided something Richard Carter hadn't expected: a witness willing to testify about the internal workings of his criminal organization. Madison knew about offshore accounts, about victim elimination protocols, about corruption networks that extended to neighboring counties. Her testimony could break open cases that had been cold for years, providing justice for families who'd lost loved ones to Richard Carter's violence. The price of that testimony would be high. Madison would have to face the reality that her father was a monster, and that her own actions had contributed to his crimes. The moment when everything crystallized came at 6:47 p.m., when Thomas Sullivan's phone rang with news that would change the investigation forever. Federal agents had arrested Richard Carter at his office, discovering evidence that connected him not just to local corruption, but to a multi-state criminal enterprise involved in human trafficking and political assassination. The case was being transferred to federal jurisdiction. The evidence Charlie had collected would become part of a racketeering prosecution that could result in life sentences for dozens of defendants. Rebecca and Madison found themselves in the strange position of being star witnesses in the same federal case. Their high school drama transformed into testimony that would help prosecute one of the region's most dangerous criminal organizations. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The girl who'd been systematically terrorized and the girl who'd done the terrorizing would have to work together to ensure justice was served. But beneath the legal complications, something more important was happening. Two young women who'd been shaped by the same violent system were finally getting the chance to heal. As news of Richard Carter's arrest spread through Riverside, as federal agents seized documents and computers that would reveal the full scope of the criminal enterprise, as reporters began investigating corruption stories that had been buried for decades, the community realized they'd been living under the control of organized crime. The perfect suburban facade had hidden trafficking routes and murder schemes that made Riverside a hub for regional criminal activity. The investigation that had started with Rebecca's adoption records had uncovered a conspiracy that extended far beyond anyone's imagination. Charlie's surveillance equipment had captured something else that night: footage of Madison breaking down in the parking lot after her confession. Her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of betraying her family to protect people she'd been taught to see as enemies. Rebecca watched that footage with complicated emotions, recognizing in Madison's tears the same grief she'd felt when learning the truth about her birth parents' deaths. They were both orphans now, both victims of the same man's violence, both facing futures where family meant something completely different than what they'd believed. The federal investigation moved with surprising speed. Richard Carter's criminal enterprise had been under surveillance for months, and Madison's testimony provided the final pieces needed to secure convictions. Within 48 hours, arrests were being made across 3 states. Corrupt officials, criminal enforcers, and business leaders who'd profited from human misery were being led away in handcuffs. The network that had seemed so powerful and untouchable was collapsing under the weight of evidence that Charlie's surveillance efforts had helped preserve. But the most significant arrest came on Thursday morning, when federal agents surrounded Riverside High School's administrative building and emerged with Principal Williams in custody. The investigation had revealed that the school's administration had been actively participating in the cover-up, providing information about Detective Sullivan's daughter, facilitating Madison's harassment campaign, and ensuring that no official reports were filed that might compromise the criminal organization. The corruption had infected every institution that was supposed to protect children. Madison's world collapsed completely when she learned about Principal Williams's arrest, realizing that every authority figure she'd trusted had been part of her father's criminal enterprise. The harassment campaign hadn't been her idea. It had been orchestrated by adults who'd manipulated her love for her family into a weapon against another victim. The guilt and shame of that realization sent Madison into emotional crisis. But it also provided the motivation she needed to cooperate fully with federal investigators. Rebecca found Madison crying in the school library that afternoon, surrounded by college preparation books that would never be used. Her future as uncertain as Rebecca's had been before Thomas Sullivan's adoption. The conversation that followed was awkward and painful, 2 teenagers trying to navigate forgiveness and accountability while processing trauma that most adults couldn't handle. But it was also necessary, because healing from systematic abuse required understanding how the system had turned victims against each other. "I destroyed your clothes," Madison whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of crying. "I tried to destroy your life, your family, everything that mattered to you. How can you even look at me without wanting revenge?" The question hung between them like a challenge, an invitation to continue the cycle of violence that had defined both their lives. But Rebecca's response surprised them both, because revenge was a luxury she couldn't afford, and healing required something more difficult than anger. Because, Rebecca said quietly, her gray eyes holding steady contact with Madison's tear-filled blue ones. My father taught me that justice isn't about punishment. It's about making sure the violence stops. Your father's violence destroyed both our families, but we can choose to stop it here, between us. We can choose to be something different than what he made us. The words carried weight that neither teenager was prepared for. The possibility that survival could become healing, that victimhood could become strength. The realization that would change everything came when Charlie showed them both the complete surveillance files, months of footage that revealed how systematically Madison had been manipulated into attacking Rebecca. Phone calls where Richard Carter explicitly ordered his daughter to escalate the harassment. Meetings where corrupt school officials provided detailed information about Rebecca's schedule and vulnerabilities. Financial pressures that were applied whenever Madison showed reluctance to participate in the campaign. Madison hadn't just been a bully. She'd been an abused child forced to abuse another child to protect the only family she'd ever known. But the files also revealed something else. Evidence that Rebecca's birth parents had been investigating the same criminal network that had eventually adopted her into its victim list. Their deaths hadn't been accidental. They'd been assassinated because they'd discovered human trafficking routes that Richard Carter's organization was protecting. Rebecca's entire life story was connected to the corruption case. Her adoption by Detective Sullivan hadn't been coincidental, but part of a larger pattern of violence and survival that stretched back decades. The weight of that revelation sent both teenagers into emotional territory they weren't equipped to handle alone. But they weren't alone anymore. Thomas Sullivan's investigation had connected them to federal resources, trauma counselors, and victim advocates who specialized in organized crime cases. For the first time in their lives, they had access to help from adults who understood the complexity of their situation and weren't compromised by corruption or personal agenda. As the federal investigation expanded, as more arrests were made and more evidence was discovered, as the true scope of Richard Carter's criminal empire became clear, Rebecca and Madison found themselves at the center of one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in the region's history. Their testimony would help convict dozens of defendants. Their evidence would close cold cases that had haunted families for years. Their courage would help ensure that other children wouldn't become victims of the same system that had tried to destroy them both. But the most important transformation was happening between them. The slow, difficult process of turning enemy into ally, trauma into strength, isolation into connection. They studied together for federal testimony prep. They attended counseling sessions where they learned to process complex trauma. They discovered that surviving systematic abuse required skills that most teenagers never developed. The friendship that emerged from that shared experience was unlike anything either had imagined possible. The breakthrough came during a late-night conversation in the Riverside Police Department's Victim Services Office, both teenagers waiting for their parents to finish meetings with federal prosecutors, both processing the reality that their high school experience had been permanently altered by forces beyond their control. Madison was struggling with guilt over her role in the harassment campaign. Rebecca was struggling with anger over the systematic nature of the abuse they'd both experienced. "Do you think we would have been friends?" Madison asked suddenly, breaking hours of comfortable silence. "If my father hadn't been a criminal, if your parents hadn't been murdered, if none of this had happened, do you think we would have liked each other?" The question revealed everything Madison was trying to process. The possibility that her entire personality had been shaped by trauma and manipulation. That the person she'd become wasn't who she'd been meant to be. Rebecca considered the question with the kind of careful analysis she applied to everything, weighing evidence, examining possibilities, trying to separate truth from wishful thinking. "I think," she said finally, "that we would have been exactly who we needed to be for each other. Strong enough to survive what happened, brave enough to fight back, smart enough to help each other heal. Maybe that's friendship, not who we would have been in perfect circumstances, but who we choose to become, despite everything that tried to break us." And the moment that would define everything came at 11:37 p.m. on a Friday night, when federal agents surrounded the Carter family home with arrest warrants for conspiracy, racketeering, and murder. Madison watched from the victim services office as news footage showed her childhood home being searched, evidence boxes being carried away, a lifetime of memories being catalogued as criminal evidence. But beside her sat Rebecca Sullivan, no longer her victim, but her friend, proof that even the most devastating circumstances could be transformed into something meaningful. The investigation that had started with a torn blouse in a high school locker room had uncovered a criminal conspiracy that spanned decades, but it had also revealed something more important. Two teenagers who'd been weaponized against each other by systematic abuse had chosen to become something different. Allies instead of enemies. Healers instead of victims. Friends instead of perpetrators and targets. Their story would inspire other survivors. Their courage would help other families find justice. Their friendship would prove that even the most damaged relationships could be rebuilt on foundations of truth and mutual support. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on Saturday morning. Thomas Sullivan's phone buzzing with the kind of urgency that made Rebecca bolt upright in bed, her tactical training instantly alert to danger signals. Federal Agent Martinez's voice was strained as he delivered news that changed everything. Richard Carter had escaped federal custody during a prisoner transport, and intelligence suggested he was planning one final act of revenge before fleeing the country. The target wasn't the investigators or the federal agents. It was the two teenagers whose testimony threatened to destroy his entire criminal empire. "Rebecca," Thomas said quietly, his detective instincts warring with his parental fears. "We need to move you to a safe house immediately. Carter's organization has resources we're still discovering, and they've made it clear that silencing you and Madison is their top priority." But Rebecca's response surprised everyone in the room, because her tactical training had been preparing for exactly this moment, and she had no intention of running from the man who'd destroyed both their families. The truth about Rebecca's SWAT training emerged in that pre-dawn conversation. What Thomas had described as therapy was actually preparation for deep cover operations. Rebecca's adoptive father had been grooming her to become the youngest federal informant in the program's history, someone who could infiltrate criminal organizations that recruited teenagers for trafficking operations. Her tactical skills weren't just for personal protection, they were tools for dismantling the network that had murdered her birth parents and countless other victims. Madison received her warning 30 minutes later. Federal agents surrounding her temporary foster home with news that her father's final gambit involved eliminating the daughter who'd betrayed him. But instead of fear, Madison felt something unexpected. Relief that the lies were finally ending. Determination to finish what she'd started when she chose truth over family loyalty. The girl who'd been manipulated into attacking Rebecca was ready to stand beside her former victim and face whatever Richard Carter's desperation unleashed. Charlie's surveillance network proved invaluable in tracking Carter's movements. Facial recognition software and traffic cameras painting a picture of a man whose carefully constructed criminal empire was collapsing around him. But the intelligence also revealed something terrifying. Carter wasn't planning to kill the teenagers quickly or quietly. He intended to make their deaths public spectacles, sending a message to anyone who might consider cooperating with federal investigators. The plan was sophisticated, brutal, and designed to maximize psychological impact on other potential witnesses. The final confrontation came at Riverside High School, the same building where the harassment campaign had begun, now chosen by Carter as the stage for his revenge. Federal agents had anticipated this move, transforming the school into a tactical operations center while maintaining the appearance of normal weekend maintenance. Rebecca and Madison weren't bait in this operation. They were partners. Their combined knowledge of Carter's methods and motivations essential to predicting his final moves. "Everything we've survived has led to this moment," Rebecca told Madison as they prepared for what federal tacticians called a high-probability violent encounter. "Your father taught you his weaknesses when he trained you to hurt me. My training taught me to turn those weaknesses into weapons. We're not victims anymore. We're the solution to a problem that's destroyed too many families." The confidence in Rebecca's voice steadied Madison's nerves. Proof that survival could become strength when victims refused to stay broken. Carter's assault on the school began at 4:37 p.m. Coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm federal security and create chaos that would allow him access to the teenagers whose testimony threatened his freedom. But what Carter didn't understand was that Rebecca's tactical training included scenarios exactly like this one. And Madison's intimate knowledge of her father's strategic thinking provided insights that professional negotiators couldn't match. The building became a battlefield where psychology mattered more than weapons. Carter's desperation making him predictable to the daughter who'd studied his methods for 17 years. Madison anticipated his movements, predicted his pressure points, and guided federal agents through tactical responses that neutralized his advantages. Rebecca's SWAT training transformed her into a force multiplier, someone who could execute complex operations while maintaining the emotional control necessary for hostage situations. When Carter finally reached the classroom where Rebecca and Madison waited, when he faced the two teenagers whose courage had destroyed his criminal empire, when he raised the weapon that was supposed to silence them forever, something unexpected happened. Madison stepped forward, not to protect herself, but to shield Rebecca, choosing friendship over self-preservation, proving that even the most damaged relationships could be rebuilt on foundations of mutual sacrifice. "You're not my father anymore," Madison said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of finality that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. "My real family is standing behind me, people who chose to love me despite everything you made me do. You taught me to hurt people, but Rebecca taught me to heal them. You built your power on fear, but we built ours on truth. Your story ends here. Ours is just beginning." Rebecca's response to Carter's final threat demonstrated everything she'd learned about transforming trauma into strength, disarming him with precision that impressed federal tacticians, restraining him with minimum necessary force, and ensuring his capture without unnecessary violence. The girl who'd been systematically terrorized had become someone who could protect others from the same fate. Proof that survival skills could evolve into service to something greater than personal vengeance. The aftermath brought revelations that exceeded everyone's expectations. Carter's capture led to the discovery of trafficking routes that had operated for decades, criminal partnerships that extended across international borders, and victim networks that included hundreds of children who could finally receive justice. The case became a model for how federal investigators could partner with young survivors to dismantle organized crime from within. Rebecca and Madison's courage inspiring other victims to come forward with testimony that solved cold cases dating back 20 years. Madison's transformation from perpetrator to advocate became legendary in victim services circles. Her understanding of manipulation tactics, helping counselors develop new approaches for treating adolescents who'd been weaponized by family criminal enterprises. She testified before Congress about how organized crime recruited children, spoke at conferences about healing from complex trauma, and dedicated her life to ensuring that other teenagers wouldn't be forced to choose between family loyalty and moral clarity. Rebecca's evolution from victim to protector led to a career in federal law enforcement, becoming the youngest agent ever accepted into the FBI's Organized Crime Division, specializing in cases involving trafficked children and criminal family systems. Her tactical skills, combined with her lived experience of systematic abuse, made her uniquely qualified to help other families escape the kind of violence that had shaped her childhood. Their friendship became the foundation for a victim advocacy organization that revolutionized how communities responded to organized crime, combining law enforcement resources with survivor expertise, tactical training with trauma counseling, federal investigation capabilities with grassroots healing initiatives. The girl who'd torn another girl's blouse and the girl whose hidden scars had been exposed worked together to ensure that other children's trauma remained private until they chose to share it on their own terms. If you've ever wondered how strong you really are, how much healing is possible after systematic betrayal, or whether friendship can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, share your story in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful transformations happen when we stop seeing each other as enemies and start recognizing our shared humanity. And your experiences might inspire someone else who's fighting similar battles. The investigation that began with teenage bullying ended with the prosecution of one of the largest criminal organizations in regional history. But the real victory was personal. Two young women who'd been shaped by violence chose to become healers. Survivors who could have remained enemies became friends who protected each other. Victims of systematic abuse transformed their trauma into strength that helped other families find safety and justice. Today, Rebecca Sullivan and Madison Carter work together at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Crimes Against Children Division. Their shared experience of surviving organized crime making them uniquely qualified to help other young victims navigate the complex process of escaping criminal family systems. Their story proves that even the most devastating circumstances can be transformed into something meaningful, that healing is possible even after the deepest betrayals, and that the strongest friendships sometimes emerge from the most unlikely beginnings. Richard Carter received 5 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. His criminal organization was completely dismantled, and the trafficking networks he'd protected were shut down permanently. But the real justice came in watching Rebecca and Madison build lives defined by service rather than survival, friendship rather than fear, healing rather than hatred. They turned their shared trauma into a shared mission, proving that sometimes the most powerful revenge is refusing to let violence define your future. Their message to other survivors remains simple, but profound. You are stronger than what happened to you, braver than you believe, and capable of transforming even the most painful experiences into sources of strength that can help others heal. The girl whose clothes were torn and the girl who tore them discovered that friendship isn't about perfect circumstances. It's about choosing to see each other's humanity despite everything that tried to make them enemies. And that choice, to heal rather than hurt, to build rather than destroy, to love rather than fear, that choice changes everything. 5 years later, the Rebecca Sullivan Foundation has helped over 3,000 young survivors escape organized crime situations. Their innovative approach, combining tactical training with trauma therapy, creating a model that federal agencies now implement nationwide. Madison Carter's testimony before international courts has contributed to the prosecution of trafficking networks across 4 continents. Her expertise in criminal family manipulation, helping prosecutors understand how children become unwilling participants in organized crime. But perhaps the most powerful testament to their transformation lies in the thousands of letters they receive from survivors who found hope in their story. Teenagers who discovered that being victimized doesn't define your worth. Young adults who learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. Families who realized that healing is possible even after the most devastating betrayals. Each letter represents another life touched by the choice two enemies made to become friends. Another person who decided that survival could become service. Their story continues to ripple outward, inspiring legislation that protects child witnesses in organized crime cases, training programs that teach educators to recognize signs of family criminal involvement, and support networks that help survivors rebuild their lives on foundations of truth rather than fear. The locker room incident that began with cruelty ended with courage, proving that sometimes the most broken people become the most powerful healers. In a world where division often seems stronger than unity, where trauma can feel insurmountable, where the cycle of violence appears unbreakable, Rebecca and Madison stand as living proof that transformation is always possible. Their friendship didn't erase the pain they'd experienced. It transformed that pain into purpose. They couldn't change what Richard Carter had done to both their families, but they could ensure that his violence stopped with them. If their story has touched something in your heart, if you've ever needed proof that healing is possible or that enemies can become family, if you've survived something that felt insurmountable and found strength you didn't know you possessed, know that your story matters too. Every person who chooses healing over hatred, hope over despair, connection over isolation, becomes part of a movement that changes the world, one relationship at a time. The torn blouse that revealed hidden scars became a symbol of hidden strength. The harassment campaign that was meant to destroy became the foundation for healing. The father's crimes that were supposed to divide became the shared experience that united. Rebecca Sullivan and Madison Carter proved that our worst moments don't have to define us. Our greatest victories can emerge from our deepest pain. And sometimes the most unlikely friendships create the strongest foundations for changing the world.